When the pandemic hit, it upended everything about our daily lives. Suddenly, things we'd taken for granted, like picking up groceries or visiting friends, became complicated, if not impossible. And if you lived somewhere remote, you discovered pretty quickly that your supply chains were fragile at best. I was living in a country where alcohol wasn't easy to get on a good day. And once the virus shut down borders and movement, it became almost mythical. The local supplier everyone relied on was locked down indefinitely. No one knew when shipments would resume. So, as people ran out of their stashes, the collective mood dipped. You could feel it everywhere. The small comforts were gone, and it felt like the walls were closing in. That's when I decided to dust off a skill I hadn't used in 15 years. Brewing. I'd learned it long before, back home where we called the rough stuff Wapatui. Simple country wine, strong mead, and grain-based beers that were never fancy, but always reliable. At first, I just made a few gallons for myself and a couple of close friends. But word traveled quickly. Soon, I was trading bottles and jugs for fresh produce, favors, and anything else people could spare. It wasn't a business, just a way to keep spirits, literally, alive when everything felt bleak. Most people were grateful. Some were downright thrilled. But there's always one person who can't stand to see others happy. And in our little circle, that person was a man I'll call D. If you'd met D on the street, you'd think he was harmless enough. Middle-aged, always trying to sound knowledgeable about everything. But he had a streak of resentment that showed up whenever someone else got attention. Before the lockdown, he'd made wine too, but his batches were, to put it kindly, inconsistent. Sometimes drinkable, sometimes astringent enough to strip varnish. Still, he liked to talk as if he were an authority. So when I started brewing again and people began trading for my bottles, it clearly grated on him. At first, he made little comments. Well, anyone can make sugar wine. Probably tastes like cough syrup. Real vintners don't use plastic jugs. I ignored it. Everyone knew he was insecure. But as more people started to ask for my mead or my beers, D's bitterness escalated. He'd show up at gatherings and loudly critique my bottles, without even tasting them. Too cloudy. Probably contaminated. You can't make decent wine from local fruit. His wife always chimed in with a tight smile, backing him up. I tried to shrug it off, but it got old fast. Especially because, while he was busy sneering, I was hauling trunk loads of my stuff to friends who genuinely appreciated it. The real kicker? Whenever he brought his own bottles to parties, no one touched them. People would quietly set them aside or leave them behind. But he couldn't admit that maybe, just maybe, he was the problem. Instead, he decided that insulting me in front of everyone would somehow prove his superiority. One evening, we planned a sampling night at a friend's house. The idea was simple. Everyone would bring a few bottles, and we'd compare, share, and swap tips. I knew D would be there. I also knew he wouldn't be able to resist taking another swipe at me. And I was right. That night, as soon as people started gathering for the sampling, I knew exactly how it was going to go. D had that look on his face, like he was just waiting for the moment he could step into the spotlight and remind everyone how inferior my brewing was. The rest of us were there to share, trade ideas, maybe relax after months of isolation. But for him, this was an arena. As I set out the bottles, I could already feel the weight of his scrutiny. He never just watched, he judged. You could see it in the way he tilted his head, eyes narrowed like he was cataloging my supposed failings. The worst part was that, in the early months, I used to care. I'd second-guess every step of my process. Was the fruit overripe? Did I rack it too late? Maybe the color was off. But as the weeks turned into months, something shifted. People I respected, the ones who tasted with open minds, kept coming back for more. They'd trade me anything they had. Fresh eggs, jars of pickles, loaves of homemade bread. They liked what I made. And more importantly, they trusted me to make something worth sharing. Meanwhile, D was stuck on the sidelines, trying to convince everyone he knew better. It wasn't about the wine anymore. It was about control. About being the authority no one had asked for. I realized that if he couldn't feel superior, he wasn't happy. And when someone is that determined to be the smartest person in the room, there's only one thing they fear: being exposed. That was when the idea first flickered across my mind. Not a big, dramatic confrontation. Just an opportunity. A chance to let him show everyone who he really was without me needing to say a word. So when I packed up my bottles for the sampling, I made sure to include one of his own. It wasn't hard. He'd left a half case at my place months earlier, insisting we should study it as an example. He never came to pick it up. That bottle had sat there, gathering dust, waiting for its moment. And that night it had finally arrived. I set it in the middle of my selections. Didn't label it. Didn't announce anything. Just let it blend in with everything else I'd made. As people started filling their glasses, there was a comfortable murmur of conversation. Someone complimented the clarity of the mead. Another asked if I'd used local berries in the wine. Then D stepped forward, picked up the unmarked bottle, and poured himself a generous glass. He swirled it with the pomp of a man who wanted everyone to watch. He sniffed, face pinched in exaggerated concentration. Then he took a sip, and without pausing even half a second to taste it, launched into his performance. "This is exactly what I've been saying," he declared to the room. "It's unbalanced, probably oxidized. Amateur work, really. I mean, just look at the legs on the glass."
No complexity.
He sounded so sure of himself, so smugly convinced he was finally proving a point. I felt something inside me settle. I could have called him out then and there. Could have raised my voice, demanded he explain why he'd spent months insulting me. But I didn't want a scene. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth of who he was to be undeniable to everyone in that room. So I waited for the silence to grow just a fraction longer. Then I smiled. "Well," I said evenly, "you made that one." I paused just long enough to watch the confusion register. "I didn't want you to feel left out." The hush that followed was the best part. One person bit their lip to keep from laughing. Someone else stared wide-eyed between us. Dee's mouth worked soundlessly. You could practically see him scrambling for a way to recover. His wife looked like she wished she could vanish. He set the glass down so carefully you'd think it was going to explode. And in that moment, all his superiority evaporated. He'd built his identity around being the expert, the critic. But he couldn't even recognize his own product. It was petty, sure. But it was also perfect. Because nothing I could have said, no argument or accusation, would have revealed the truth more effectively than letting him condemn his own work. He'd finally proven he didn't have a clue what he was talking about. And everyone saw it. The funny thing was my plan wasn't some elaborate scheme. I didn't need to forge labels or rig a taste test. All I had to do was quietly let D walk himself into his own trap. The moment I decided to bring that bottle, I knew he wouldn't be able to resist making a show. That was who he was. He couldn't just be part of something, he had to perform dominance. While everyone else was content to sip and chat, he was scanning for an opening to make a declaration. So when I tucked that bottle among my own, I didn't feel sneaky. I felt satisfied. Because for months, I'd endured his little digs and backhanded insults. I'd watched him talk over people who actually had questions. I'd seen him corner newcomers to lecture them about proper technique and refined taste. And every time I'd bitten my tongue. But that night, I wasn't interested in playing along anymore. I made sure to arrive early, set everything out, and greet people warmly. I poured small tastes for everyone, letting them choose, encouraging them to compare. When D arrived, he gave me a look that was half smirk, half challenge. Like he was thinking, "Let's see what you've got this time." I didn't flinch. I just said, "Help yourself," and stepped back. I didn't rush to draw attention. I didn't introduce the bottle, because I knew he'd find it on his own. And when he did, he performed exactly as I'd expected. Sniffing, swirling, and then dismissing it as amateur work before he'd even tasted it properly. The simplicity of it was what made it perfect.
No grandstanding. No arguments.
Just a clean little moment where he revealed himself for exactly what he was. A man so desperate to feel superior that he didn't even recognize his own product. That was all it took. One line, "You made that one. I didn't want you to feel left out." And the entire room knew. After I said it, the quiet was electric. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels tense or aggressive. It was the kind of silence where everyone is holding their breath, waiting to see if the person caught red-handed will try to bluff their way out. Dee stared at me, his mouth working like he was trying to summon a comeback. But there wasn't one. He just publicly trashed his own wine, in front of everyone whose approval he'd been chasing for months. His wife looked mortified. She glanced around as if hoping someone would change the subject. No one did. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but more than one person was clearly biting back laughter. It was amazing how fast the mood shifted. Suddenly, the room didn't belong to him anymore. He'd lost the power he'd been clinging to, the image of the expert, the authority, the guy everyone should defer to. Instead, he was just a man who couldn't taste the difference between his own work and the thing he claimed to despise. After a long moment, he set the glass down with exaggerated care. "Well," he muttered, voice stiff, "I think we're going to head out." No one stopped him. No one rushed to soothe his ego or protest that he was right. He and his wife gathered their things in awkward silence. They didn't say goodbye. They slipped out the door, and the hush finally broke. First with a nervous chuckle, then with open laughter. Someone clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well played." Another person raised their glass and toasted me. For the rest of the evening, the tension dissolved. People were more relaxed than I'd ever seen them. Like everyone had been quietly waiting for someone to call Dee's bluff. I hadn't planned to humiliate him. He hadn't just been undermining me, he'd been undermining everyone, making them feel like they had to measure up to standards only he could define. And now that spell was broken. After that night, things changed. I didn't see Dee at any more sampling events. No more comments about proper technique. No more lectures about real wine. He faded out of the circle he'd once tried to dominate. I can't say for certain what he told himself afterward. Maybe he decided we were all petty and ungrateful. Maybe he convinced himself I'd tricked him somehow. It didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time since I'd started brewing again, I felt completely at ease. People stopped worrying about whether their taste was refined. They just enjoyed the evenings. We shared recipes. We traded jars of homemade preserves for bottles of mead. The gatherings became what they were always meant to be, about community, not competition. Sometimes, I'd remember the look on his face when I told him the wine was his. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was relief. Relief that I didn't have to carry the burden of his insecurities anymore. Relief that I didn't have to defend myself against someone who'd never tasted with an open mind. I learned something important that night. You don't always have to fight to prove your worth. Sometimes, the best way to deal with people who can't stand your success is to let them expose themselves. A single sentence, "You made that one," said more than any argument ever could. And when it was all over, the people who mattered were still there, glasses raised, smiling without reservation. Some victories are loud. Mine was quiet, and it was enough.